North Idaho College and this evening's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
This evening, we are fortunate to have as our guest a well-known author and consultant in the field of psychology and psychiatry with special emphasis in biofeedback. Our guest is Dr. Barbara Brown. In the past, she has been the chief of experiential physiology at the VA hospital in Los Angeles associated with UCLA. She also has been a lecturer in psychiatry at UCLA. She holds a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Cincinnati. As I've indicated, she is well known as an author, including books entitled Supermind, Stress, and the Art of Biofeedback, and Travel Through the Mind of India. Dr. Brown, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
Joining with me and questioning our guest this evening will be regular panelist Mary Lou Reed, visiting panel member Don Sprague from the field of psychology at North Idaho College, and regular panelist Janelle Burke. We will commence the questioning with Lou Reed.
Dr. Brown, you have done a lot of work on stress. Tony mentioned that you'd written a book called Stress and the Art of Biofeedback. In our earlier conversation, you said that previous understandings and concepts about stress were completely crazy. Would you explain what you mean by that and where you feel new concepts about stress are going?
My word.
Was that too much?
The answer to that question really is going to take a whole new book. In fact, I'm being commissioned to write a book on this, and it's going to be a big book because, as you indicated, I did say that earlier concepts have been misleading or inaccurate or inappropriate, and the newer concepts basically have to do with the role of the mind. I don't know really how much I should say about the prevalence of these new concepts because I seem to have generated them. I may have a glorified picture of how far they've gone. They've gone far enough so that we're going to have a symposium at Columbia on these ideas, and there is, or will be soon, a scientific article on this concept in Hans Selye's new book. Now, what does it say? It basically says that in the past, stress has been considered to be, and I'll have to use a funny scientific word, implemented in the body by something called arousal. And that means simply that the physiologic systems of the body become activated. And this is your stress, in part. I'm trying to give it very briefly. Further exposition of this kind of a theory says, well, that's because stress activates the hypothalamus and the pituitary in the brain and the autonomic nervous system, and that's why we show all of these symptoms, anxiety and muscle tensions and tension headaches and a whole variety of stress reactions. And there never has been any kind of theory which postulated how in the world that stress out there that affects us every day leaps into the mind and stimulates and turns on all of these things in the brain. We've had two kinds of theories that have said something happens between the stress that's out there and how we react to the stress that's out there. But neither theory has ever tried to document what really goes on between what's out there and how we react to what's out there. And that's basically where I come into the picture.
What really goes on?
What really goes on. And what really goes on is relatively simple. I'm not sure. You want me to take enough time
Yes,
to
please.
try to explain? Well, I'll try to do it in as few words as possible. What really goes on is that the kinds of stress we're talking about today our reaction, our emotional reactions, our anxieties, depressions, insomnia, headache, ulcers, asthma, high blood pressure, these kinds of stress reactions. Those reactions occur to the kind of stress that are induced by our interacting with people out there, or people things. Groups of people, what groups of people do to other people. But basically, stress is a result of us interacting with our social environment. Our social environment meaning other people, our relationships with people, other groups of people, and even impersonal kinds of activities of groups of people, like industry. And how come General Motors doesn't clean up their engines so they don't pollute the air? That's an impersonal kind of thing. All right, so that's an interaction between us and out there. And the only way that we can interpret stress from being out there is how we perceive what's going out there, out there. And what we perceive is a function of us and our expectations and our hopes and our dreams, our cultures, our learning, our experiences, and all of these kinds of things. So we cannot have stress unless the mind manufactures it. And it is the body that is reacting to the stress that the mind manufactures. Now, why should the mind ever manufacture stress? Next question. I want to anticipate what you're going to say.
Thank you.
Why should it ever manufacture stress? Very simple. Two things. One, because it doesn't really know enough about people out there and the behavior of people out there, the behavior of groups of people, what's going on in other people's minds, because people are the most difficult things in the world to try to understand. All of what they mean and think is hidden behind their behavior and their masks and their compulsions from their cultures to behave in certain ways. So we have tremendous difficulties in understanding people. This is one of the big reasons for this new swing in understanding people and asserting yourself, understanding yourself, and so on. So what we basically lack when our minds manufacture stress is information about people out there and people things and people's behaviors and personalities and what they mean. In other words, education in psychology, which I think should begin in the first grade, you see. That's one thing. Now, the second thing is we need some kind of information about how the body is reacting, because traditionally in our culture, we have never really paid attention to our own bodies. Curiously enough, in our Western culture, we have taken our own precious bodies and dumped them into the hands of some experts called physicians. And we no longer own them, basically. So we don't think about them. So we don't know how we're reacting. So we're not aware. So what we need to know also is how we as people in our bodies and our feelings are reacting when we're interacting with the rest of society. And I'm not sure I answered or not, but I have a feeling I've been talking too long.
That was excellent. Thank you.
Don Sprague.
Okay, let's go along with this, but become a little more specific. Let's say that I come to you. I come into an institution that you're working into a hospital. I have a high-stress job. I have high blood pressure. I'm overweight. I don't exercise enough, and I smoke too much. And my doctor, my medical doctor, tells me that you've got to drop your blood pressure, or there's a significant chance of some type of cardiac problem. How would your treatment using biofeedback differ from the traditional medical model type of treatment?
Well, first of all, I don't want to be confined to biofeedback.
Okay.
Unless you indicate biofeedback as a generic term,
Yes.
which indicates feeding back any kind of information about the body in any way into the person, not necessarily through what are now traditional biofeedback instruments. What would be my procedure for dealing with that problem? Well, obviously, first of all, because of my medical training, I'd insist upon a medical examination. and a complete rundown. I'd also probably like a good psychologic profile of the individual. But let's say that there are no outstanding problems in either area, no medical nor psychologic problems that are considered necessary to work with or deal with. Then what I would be doing is two things. And I just talked about the kinds of information people need so that they're not stressed. I would, A, attempt to use some kind of counseling technique, or basically nothing more than educational technique, to tell people, one, that what they don't know is that they don't know, that they don't have enough information. That's the most important thing. People think they know things, and they don't. The second thing is I would give them information about their social reality. I mean, try to understand all of the things about human behavior that is necessary for them as an individual, excuse me, in their relationships. And then, as far as the specific thing you're after, in biofeedback, as a generic term, you can use yoga, body awareness techniques, and all of these kinds of things. The reason for these techniques is because it directs the person's attention to the body. And a very curious thing happens to people when they become aware of how they are reacting at any time and how their physical being is behaving. They almost intuitively understand that that's not really appropriate. And the normal regulating mechanisms that usually run on automatic begin to take over at that point. So that I hope I've answered that in part.
How would that differ from a traditional medical approach, which would probably be, let's put the individual on chemotherapy and get the blood pressure down?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Because just what you said, it would be a medical approach with a bunch of no-nos. Don't smoke, don't eat too much, and some do's, go out and exercise and so on, plus drugs. And that would basically be the medical model for treatment. Now, there is a I can't think of the word to use, but it's an appalling discrepancy that one finds in these situations. If indeed your high blood pressure is shown to be a result of various psychosocial factors, why in the name of heaven are you treating it medically? I mean, that's the bottom line. I think we're going to have to change all of our approaches and understandings.
Janelle Burke.
The mind is a fascinating part of our body. It's also a part that is a bit fearful and a bit frightening to us because we don't understand it often. Can you tell us a little bit about the mind? How is the mind different from the brain, for example? Why do you say mind instead of brain?
Well, let's see, I think I can answer it in two different ways. One is that mind, as generally considered by psychologists who claim to deal with it and don't, it is claimed to be all of the various processes going on and make up things like how we perceive the world, how we perceive things around us, how we remember the world, how we think about our lives and situations, how we make decisions, how we form concepts and all these things. And basically, most of these functions and operations of the mind have not really been studied in any detail. The dominant force has been the influence of the physical sciences, which has said, you've got to show us physical activity before we'll believe what you say is going on in the mind. Well, it's very hard to document the physical activity of thoughts and so on. So one reason is the dominance of the attitude that we must have physical measurements for what the mind does. And along those lines, most of our physical sciences have dealt only with the physical manifestations or consequences of what the mind does. The states, for example, that the mind produces, but not what the mind is doing. And oh dear, I've forgotten the second part of the answer that I had in mind.
That's pretty comprehensive. I think what I was really after was what are the different parts? Do you go into that in your research? Do you go into different parts of the brain and the way they react to our body?
Well, excuse me, it's nice to know what different parts of the brain are doing to different parts of the body. But the bottom line again is that there is an intangible essence that is capable of manipulating all body functions. And that essence we call, for lack of a better term, mind. Now, I remember the other argument that I wanted to use, and that's an argument from cybernetics, which basically says that when a new system is evolved from two interacting systems or two or more interacting systems, you probably cannot predict the characteristics of that new system. You can predict them to some extent if those interacting systems have similar characteristics, are harmonious with each other. But when you take two different systems that are unlike, and a new system is evolved from the interaction of those two systems, and you get a system that is different, you can't predict, you don't know anything about it. And it is postulated, or at least I postulated, that this is what happened in the neurologic development of the mind, that a new system was evolved, and that it had no relationship at all to any prior system. And I thought, oh, I'm a genius. You know, I thought of a new thing. This is really great. And then I got Conrad Lorenz's new book, and he said the same thing. So I feel good that other people, or at least one eminent scientist, feels exactly the same way. They call the creative flash that the cognitive apparatus of man is a new creation in the history of the natural universe. That's the key.
Lou Reed.
Dr. Brown, you say that stress is manufactured by the mind and conveyed to the body. Do you think that the mind in some individuals may choose to manufacture this stress as a way of finding motivation and as a way of making life more exciting? I guess one of my questions has to do with how do you account for the fact that some people are under more stress than others, and it doesn't seem to be necessarily the way that they are internalizing it. It may just be something that they could choose to manufacture.
I'm not really sure, at least I haven't gone into that area, but I'm not terribly sure that people really do choose to manufacture stress. I think that people are more likely to observe stress or not cope with it successfully, depending upon all of those variables that make up human beings. Their constitution, their genetic background, their education, their experiences, all of these kinds of things go into the way in which we react to our social environment. Now, most of us, when we see difficulties or problems in our social environment or the dynamics of our personal relationships and so on, most of us can fall back on fairly reliable ways of coping with these situations. But sometimes we really don't have the clues in our own heads to do that successfully, or the problem is too aggravating. It's too much for us to handle. And that's when we begin to react to stress. That's real stress.
But information, in your terms, information of one sort or the other is the only real way of dealing positively with stress.
Well, yes, I happen to believe that, but that's sort of a skeleton concept, you know. It has to be, there's a lot of fleshing out to do with that concept to make it really relevant to people, and I can't do that right at the moment.
Fine, thank you.
Dr. Brown, I know you spent a lot of time in Asia, India in particular, and from an earlier conversation with you, you indicated that you are now fascinated with the unconscious mind, and I believe you also have some criticisms of how the Asians have not organized and systematically dealt with that. Could you comment on this new interest that you have, or you indicated to me that you're moving from your fascination with biofeedback and stress into this new area? Would you make a few comments about what your thesis is, or what work you're doing in that
Let's
area?
see, how can I make it most immediately relevant? Well, let me try it in a twofold way. One of the pieces of what you could call definitive evidence, I think, would be when people learn to control brain waves through biofeedback techniques. Okay, they use an instrument, and this instrument tells them about their brainwave activity. Now, you have never ever had a sensory experience about your brainwaves. We have no memory, we have nothing to call on. But people can look at some abstract symbol of what's going on in the electrical activity of the brain, incredible, and learn to control that activity. They can learn to control alpha waves that are related to alertness and relaxation, theta waves which are related to concentration or drowsiness and a number of other things. And they can even learn to control the basic levels of excitability of the brain which relate to epileptic seizures. So what does that mean? That means that an individual looks at a machine, he takes in information, he processes that information, and it is his, quote, mind that tells the brain what to do. All right, this is really an incredible situation. But all you have to really look to, you don't have to look to science, you can look to your own thinking processes. Because when you think, you are essentially giving a command to the brain. Get busy now. Come on, start searching. I need some logic, I need some facts, I need some data, I need some perspective, and I want you to put it together in a certain way, and something oversees this process. Come on, so thinking, basically, is voluntary control of the brain. I don't think you can argue with it.
Don Sprague.
Okay. I'm very interested in stress because I'm a climber. How would you explain stress seekers, people that actively go out and enter into relatively high dangerous situations, climbers, race car drivers? Bruce Ogilvie at San Jose thinks that it's very, very normal to manufacture that particular type of stress, and these individuals are very normal. Would you agree with that?
I really don't know, because I don't think we have enough data in that area to make any conclusions. I've got a crazy idea in my own head about it. More than 20 years ago, I postulated that there had to be a chemical in the brain that dealt with pain. And 20 years later, it turned out to be the endomorphins. I'm now postulating that perhaps a similar situation exists with the chemistry of what we call the supergene complex. And we now think that there are related genetic materials, the totality of which is important to the general personality expressions of the individual. Obviously, that has to have some metabolic process connected with it. Why isn't it possible that those metabolic processes could contain certain biochemical substances which are the excess of which or the deficit of which is related to outgoingness or introversion and these kinds of personality characteristics? But otherwise, I don't think we have the data to know why some people seek stress.
I'm glad to know that I'm at least not deficient right now.
Janelle Buzz.
As we study the mind, I presume that you feel that one can be a more effective person by relating to the stress that the body is is producing, that the mind is producing, that the body. How does this affect us? How can we be a more efficient person, a more effective person? What concrete steps can we take to be a more effective person?
I think that's out of my field.
Okay.
But I'm not sure whether I can really comment on it in any meaningful way, except that stress basically is saying, I've got a problem with society, with my social environment, relationships. And I can't go into the details, but some people can use this very constructively. It's a challenge, it's exciting to solve the problem. Other people become frustrated with it and begin to show symptoms. Other than that, I think that I'm not really the person to answer that.
Okay, let me follow that with what happens when our body physiologically changes. As we grow, as we age, there are certain periods of time when our body actually changes physiologically. How does the mind relate to those physiological changes?
It's a fascinating question. I'm not really terribly sure that that's true. I just am beginning to have a horrible feeling that this is the effect of culture and tradition and mythologies. Because I'm just nowadays enormously impressed with some of the people. I had the opportunity to talk with some of the people who started with Gay Luce's SAGE program. And she took people in their 75 to 80 range. They were in nursing homes, either voluntarily to die or somebody put them in there to die. And she got a hold of them and did all kinds of mind-body awareness techniques. And I met them for lunch. They drove 50 miles to meet me for lunch one day when I was up in Monterey. And I have never seen a more energetic bunch of interested, quote, little old ladies that weren't, they might be little, but they weren't old anymore. So we had, she, Gay, and her programs had recovered these people to be very exciting people. They were driving, they were now in apartments, and the most incredible thing of all, they were writing grant applications to the government about how to do more of this sort of thing. Incredible. I think we should use these bits of evidence to indicate that it really is in the mind, really.
Well, certainly in different cultures, we treat different ages quite differently. Teenagers are treated quite differently in some cultures, where they are expected to assume adult roles rather than a teenager-ish kind of role that we have in our culture.
With that, I must bring our program to conclusion. On Janelle's comment, Dr. Brown, it's a pleasure having you on our program. It's been, I can say for the panel, I'm sure, most informative half hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Barbara Brown, who is an author and a consultant and a lecturer, and I'm sure you've enjoyed the program. May I invite you to be with us again next week at the same time, when again we'll be discussing what we believe to be an important issue. I am Tony Stewart. Have a good week.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.